And we are now live. Hello and welcome, everyone. Good day. My name is Kayla Johnston. I'll be your host for this NCTR dialogue talking about intergenerational trauma. I am the supervisor of the NCTR's Education Outreach and Public Programming Unit. And joining me here today, we have three special guests. We have Associate Professor Dr. Richard Verdan from BC, a regional health support worker, I should say resolution health support worker and knowledge keeper, Kathy Pompana, from ANISH Corporation here in Manitoba. And then we have a third guest joining us here today, Johnny Mickle, who is working with Strength in the Circle, a nonprofit organization. Now, with that, I'm going to give a little bit more time to each one of our speakers to talk a little bit more to themselves and then jump into some questions for each one before I bring everyone back together to do an open discussion. So if you have questions, whether you're joining us from YouTube or from Facebook, please feel free to put that in the comment and we'll be able to come back to that near the end. So with that, I'm going to take some of my guests off here and just start with Kathy today. Kathy, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about yourself before we jump into some of the pre-prepared questions we have.
Matakiapi, Chahedeshkaduta Wakiwi and Makiapi, Wipazoko Wakpa Damakota. My name is Red Circle Thunder Woman. My Earth name is Kathy Pompana. I'm from the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation, and I'm a resolution health support worker with ANISH Corporation. I've been doing this for 11 years now, and we had to sort of shift our focus from being support workers at hearings, at the residential school hearings, to providing more community outreach programming and teachings and that sort of thing. So that's what we do now.
Thank you so much for sharing a little bit. And so I want to say the residential school system, that's impacted our communities really with the purpose of killing our culture, an attack on Indigenous identity, on our community's language, spiritual beliefs, the whole gamut, and really that purpose. And we often hear the quote, "These were created to kill the Indian and the child." And now it's become common knowledge how our children were stolen from their parents, beaten, punished if they spoke their language. Some of those different effects of abuse, whether physical, psychological, sexual, spiritual, all of that has had an impact on us today. And so that's why we decided to have this talk about the lasting legacy that's been left behind, this intergenerational trauma that even though we ourselves didn't experience, the trauma of our parents and grandparents have been passed on to us today. And so I'm wondering, Kathy, could you please explain a little bit more about when we say intergenerational trauma? What does that mean? And how might that be different from, say, historical trauma?
So intergenerational trauma, for myself, I call myself an intergenerational survivor. I didn't go to residential school. I didn't go to day school, but my mom did. And I felt the effects of that. She never, she passed away when I was 16 years old. And from what I can remember before then, she never did say, "I love you," not once. She didn't hug. She wasn't very emotionally close to me. I knew she loved me because she bought me whatever I wanted. I had a room full of toys, but that's how she showed her love. She didn't know how to show it. And so I felt the effects by, her drinking, her coming home, in the middle of the night and stumbling in the door, and I'm looking after her at 8 years old. I cleaning her up, putting her to bed, because she's too inebriated to do it herself, and I'm 8 years old and I shouldn't have to do that. That's nothing that an 8-year-old girl should have to do. So those kind of things, and going to school, with friends with non-Indigenous kids, and not seeing the same sort of things that we saw in our families in their families, not seeing, drinking, drugs, alcoholism, abuse, violence, not seeing those kind of things and wondering how come they don't do those sorts of things? How come they don't have that? And thinking that there was something wrong with me, something wrong with us as Indigenous people. And so the effects of what we're feeling are what our parents passed down to us, what they taught us, um, that the traumas that they endured, they then passed on to us. And a lot of it actually wasn't passed on um, directly. It was actually passed on through our DNA. So, when they experienced trauma as children, when they went to residential school, it impacted them in a way that it actually changed their DNA. And so when they have kids of their own, they're passing that on to us as well. And what's happening is we are now, as the intergenerational survivors, passing that on to our children. And so our children are experiencing things like anxiety and stress and flashbacks and all kinds of things because of our parents and grandparents' trauma. So it's it's not something that the government could just sweep under the rug like they thought they were going to do. With the compensation process that our survivors went through, they believed, here's your money, and go away now, But what they did is they just basically opened up a can of worms, because they didn't realize how much those schools and that whole era affected our people.
Thank you about that. And that's actually giving me a springboard or leading me into this next question I have is, especially in comments we see in news articles online, they try to curb it, but we often hear this comment, why don't Indigenous people communities just get over it? And I hear this again and again. And so I'm wondering if you could just touch upon it. Why is it not easy just for us to get over this past, and just, as we hear, why can't we just focus on the future? Is often some of the comments we get from those who aren't understanding this history.
Yeah, for sure. And so, a lot of I do a presentation called the Indian Residential Schools Effects and Impacts, and I take it across the country. And it talks about all of this. And after the presentation, I get a lot of people line up after wanting to talk to me, and most of them are non-Indigenous, and they're apologizing. They're like, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize that all this had happened. But you know what? That's one of the things that they say most of all is, I thought this was, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I thought this was, ancient history. And it wasn't. This was recent past. Um, the last school in operation didn't close until 1996. That wasn't that long ago, you know. And so this is not ancient history. And it wasn't just one group of people who went to the schools. This is multiple generations in one family, let's say. The first set of kids from that one family were taken and went to residential school. They got older and had children of their own who went to residential school, who got older, had children of their own who went to residential school. So in one family, you could have 4 or 5 generations of children that went to residential school. So that's a huge amount of years, of one family's children having gone to residential school. And so that's a lot of compounded unresolved trauma in one family that we need to now try and unravel as the intergenerational survivors. We're trying to unravel all of that and figure it out and move forward. But it's hard because of, one, what was passed on to us through our DNA, 2, what was passed on to us, what they taught us. And we can't blame them because they weren't taught how to be parents. They weren't taught, they weren't shown what love was. The residential schools were totally the opposite of that. You learned how to hate, you learned how to be abusive, you learned how to be deviant. All of these things that they taught in the residential schools is all they knew. And then so when they start having children of their own, this is what they're teaching their kids. And this is how they're treating their kids. And so, we can't be angry at them or hold that against them. It wasn't their fault. But, as we're learning about the effects and how the effects are passed on from one generation to the next, it's our responsibility now as the intergenerational to unravel all of that and start smoothing it out for our generations to come.
Thank you for sharing. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit from your own perspective. How have you seen trauma change over the years? I imagine there has been a difference, say, from those survivors who are just starting that learning journey and that expression of trauma in their lives to those who may be a little further along in that journey, or even different decades compared to, say, the start of the settlement agreement to now.
Yeah, for sure. So, when we first started doing the hearing process, a lot of our survivors were, that's exactly what they were doing, is they were blaming, their family members. Why did you send me to that school? Why did you let them take me away? Why didn't you come and get me? They didn't understand that they had no choice. There was consequences um, to not complying. And so once they learned that, I remember one client that I had, for example, she, in her hearing, broke down and said exactly those things. She broke down to her mom, who was no longer with us, but she spoke to her and was very angry with her and said, "I don't know why you let them take me. Why did you do this to me?" And once she learned, after we had a long, long conversation, and once she knew that there was no choice, they had no choice, and it wasn't her fault, you could almost see the weight being lifted off of her, and she had forgiveness then for her mother, and sort of changed her whole outlook on everything about, what happened to her, why it happened to her, that the same thing probably happened to her mother. And so trauma has changed, since then, especially with us intergenerational survivors. With our residential school survivors, it was more about what happened to them, and what they went through, what they endured on a daily basis, and that's what they needed to talk about, and that's what was the cause of all their anxiety and fears and flashbacks and that sort of thing. With intergenerational survivors, it's more about, how our parents treated us, how we were raised, how we were taken out of the home, and placed with non-indigenous families, how with the whole 60 scoop, how that damaged our families and us as intergenerational survivors. And so, I have a brother who was taken in the 60 scoop, and he always, up until 5 years ago when I met him, he believed he was thrown in the garbage. He believed that we didn't, my mom believed that she didn't love him and that she just threw him away. And so that's how he lived his life. He felt like, he was garbage, and so that's how he lived his life. And so, a lot of the trauma that our intergenerational survivors are feeling is because of the actions, or the way that our parents were. They're drinking, they're fighting, um maybe they weren't together, the separation that we felt, and then feeling like maybe it was our fault, like, what did I do? And it's a mess. It's compounded, it's unresolved. It's one right after another. Like, before we could deal with one trauma, there's another one that piles on top, and then another one, and then another one, and we just push those things down. And so that's where we're kind of at right now today. Um, our survivors are, I would like to say that they are well on their healing journey. They know what they have to do now to come out of those traumas. And now it's us that's left, and we need to figure that out now for ourselves.
Thank you. And before I ask kind of the last question, I also wanted to share a little bit from my perspective. Working at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, I've heard stories related to our archivists connecting with survivors, getting some of those records, and then seeing and understanding that their parents had been coerced into giving their children over to the school or into care, and then having that better understanding, especially for the intergenerational survivors, exploring that, since a lot of this was kept underground, kept hidden, and going, I have a better understanding of why I wasn't hugged by my grandparents, or why there was corporal punishment in the home, or strong language, or that lack of kind of understanding of some of the unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict, and seeing that arise. And then what my question is, and kind of what I'm leading to, is that how do we break that cycle? Kind of what are those first steps? And I know in a lot of material I read, it's about both individual but also community action together. And so, without answering the question I just asked, I'll pass it back to you, and this will be our kind of last question before we bring Johnny on screen to talk about some of his experiences.
Yeah, so it starts with me. It starts with me. I have to, like I said, us as the intergenerational, we're the ones that are sort of picking up the pieces now. And why are we doing that? Because we have children, right? And eventually we're going to have grandchildren, and we're going to have great grandchildren, and those children are going to have children. So we do it for the generations that have yet to come. And so we don't want our kids and grandkids and so on to be treated, the same way that we were. And so we are doing something now as intergenerational survivors. And it starts with me. I have to say, you know what, I'm not going to let my kids see me drunk or passed out or high or whatever it is. I made that decision when I got pregnant with my first son, that my kids are not going to see me the way that I saw my mother. She would come home totally drunk, beat up, has urinated herself, has thrown up on herself. And I witnessed that multiple times. And so I made that choice that my kids are not going to see that. And that's what we have to do as intergenerational survivors. Some might say, well, that's so unfair. That's so unfair that we have to shoulder all of that. But it has to start somewhere. Like our survivors are healing, and that's great. And hopefully they'll be helping us. They'll be helping us to heal for the next generations now that they're sort of in a better place. So we don't have to do it alone, but also we are not alone. There are so many of us as intergenerational survivors. It starts with me, but there's so many of us that can come together and work together. And what I find is that what's happening because of oppression and internalizing that oppression, it's coming out as lateral violence, right? So what I'm finding is when any of us try to do good for ourselves or do good for our community or pass on some teachings that we received, because when we receive teachings, they're not for us to hoard, they're for us to pass on to others. And when I see people post, on Facebook, and Facebook is terrible for this, is you post on there, oh, I'm going to go do these teachings, at this place, and right away somebody jumps on it. Somebody has something to say. Somebody's criticizing. Somebody's saying, who gives you the right to go and speak about those things? And somebody's always pointing the finger. But what they don't see is that as they're pointing this finger, there's 3 fingers pointing back at them. And so, as intergenerational survivors, we need to stop doing this to each other. And we need to stop doing this to everyone who's trying to do good, I'm just trying to be the best me that I can be for my children, my grandchildren, and so on. And so we really need to stop doing that to each other, that lateral violence, because it's terrible. And once, I think once we can stop all of that, and it starts with me, right? I'm not going to allow myself to be part of that. And so I think once we can get beyond that, we'll be able to work together a lot more effectively and build each other up rather than bringing each other down.
Wonderful. Thank you for that wonderful comment. And I will say, working in this field, although I'm not necessarily a frontline worker, sometimes that's some of the reactions we have seen where, personally, I'm not Indigenous enough or I didn't experience the same level of harm. So, how can I provide advice or support? Not understanding that one person's very specific backstory or history. And so that I have heard over the years, I'll be saying, yeah, 7 years at the NCTR, lateral violence is something we have seen between organizations, groups, individuals, when really it should be about that mutual support and respect to hold each other up and support us in this work. Because there's no shortage of work, I can say. There's a lot that can go around to support each other. So thank you so much for those comments and answering our questions. I'll put you back in our backstage and we'll come and see Kathy again when we get to the Q&A. And I'll say there was a question that came through. Please continue to put your questions. I will be bringing them up in the Q&A portion. But with that, I'd like to bring Johnny to the stream. Hello and welcome. I'm wondering if you can give us a very short introduction, and then we're going to jump into some questions based upon some dialogue you had earlier today.
Good afternoon and welcome. My warrior name is ANISH Corporation, which means first fire, and you can call me Johnny. I'm originally from Norrie House Cree Nation here in Winnipeg. A lot of the work I do is focused on my home community for Norrie House.
Thank you so much. And I was trying to figure out which direction I wanted to go in, and maybe we'll start first talking about your nonprofit organization, Strengthen the Circle, and maybe we'll circle back related to your own upbringing, the impact of trauma, and kind of what led you to create this nonprofit. So if you could share a little bit more about that, that would be fantastic.
So actually, well, Strengthen the Circle is a product of my journey. Both the good and the bad. In 2017, I was in provincial custody, and after which I was able to go to treatment afforded by my veteran status in connection to Veterans Affairs. As a result, I was able to sobriety and begin a path of healing. After a year of maintaining this path of healing, a year and 2 days to be exact, I was in a dangerous situation on a bus, and I ended up intervening in this situation where a fellow Indigenous young man had a knife, an 8-inch blade. After trying to provoke me, he went after somebody else, and I was able to intervene, disarm, and detain him. And I was stabbed in the process. But as a result, because of my healing and my the new philosophies and perspectives that I picked up for my healing, I leaned more into the restorative justice principles, and I was able to pull the lens back with that situation, and get curious. From that night, there was a lot of media attention, a lot of public awareness to the issue. They even went so far as to pin me with the Medal of Bravery. So they were very focused and honed in on this hero story. And I saw the narrative of the hero story very problematic, in the sense that through labeling, when we label somebody the hero or the good guy in a story, we often miss a lot of the bigger picture. And in the hero story, there's always a villain, a bad guy, a criminal, and we don't look at the bigger picture. So with these new philosophies, I was able to pull the lens back and gain this curiosity to what the bigger story is. And I was in my own process of consciousness raising around historical trauma and collective trauma and what our people have faced. And up until that point, I only had a surface level view of growing up in a First Nation, going through a lot of what we've gone through. And so through this restorative justice process, I was able to begin visitation with this individual. I had the no contact order lifted. I started visiting him in provincial custody. And through that restorative justice process, hearing his story and being able to share my story, and to change the world as we see it, to change our worldview on, and realize, what we're going through together as peers, and look at our similarities rather than our differences. And as a result of that process, we pushed the sentencing to a sentencing circle, and that process confirmed what we already knew, that supports for our people are inadequate. We're looking at this individual's GLADU reports, looking at my GLADU report from my past experience in the criminal justice system, and seeing that we're not, our society is not dealing with the trauma, the pain, the struggling that's in our communities the way that it should be. It's reactively dealing with it rather than actually restoratively. And so with that confirmation, nonetheless, we managed to reduce his sentence from the Crown pushing for a 6-year sentence to a 3-year. And that meant it was February at that point. He was to be released at October. So I had this vision from my experiences to contribute to this healing movement, and that was my 10-year plan. And this condensed it down to, okay, we got to do something now. We got to do the best that we can with what we have and where we're at. And so that prompted me to start Strengthen the Circle. And really it was just, this was in the year of 2020. So right when COVID took off. And so but we just went through and started pushing these volunteer-based, community-led, community inclusive initiatives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing about that. And that, as soon as you brought up this narrative that we sometimes see in journalism, and I'll give a Manitoba example. A number of years ago, we had an Indigenous individual dubbed the homeless hero. In 2009, Farron Hall had jumped into the Assiniboine River to pull a teenager who had been drowning. Some years later, there were news articles coming up because of the impacts of colonization and the impacts of trauma, that he was put on the flip side of that. And then just a few years ago, actually, it says hours before Tina Fontaine had been pulled from the river, they had found Farron had drowned in the river. And so we have these specific narratives of villains and heroes we sometimes see, but we know it's much more complicated than that. And that kind of leads me a little bit to some of what Kathy had said earlier. And my question for you, and kind of knowing a little bit more about your own background history, growing little bit about some of the violence you might have seen, kind of growing up normalized to that violence. And my question is, what was that like? And I suppose, what was that tipping point, that question of it starts with me? What really prompted you to start on your journey?
Yeah, growing up in Norrie House Cree Nation, I I was very fortunate to my mother was a multi-generational she was a residential school survivor herself, but we come from a line of at least three generations of multi-generational trauma involving the residential school system, and so I was very fortunate that my mother, in a physical sense, was able to break that cycle. And my father was non-Indigenous, and I grew up in a very structured home. However, in my early teens, with my father's relapse, we went from a very structured home to one that wasn't functioning very well. And in early teenage years, in early adolescence, peer groups are very important. And I struggled with identity growing up, and I had a lot of anger, hyper masculinity. I wanted to gain acceptance with my peer groups, and I started going down this dark path. I was getting into a lot of trouble. I did end up joining the military at a very young age. I was introduced to the military at 16. I dropped out of high school by the age of 17 to join the Canadian Forces. So I went through Séjourne, Quebec for my basic, and ultimately ended up in Edmonton 2 days before my 18th birthday to be the youngest in the unit. And so I struggled with identity. In the military, I experienced racism, very interpersonal, very blatant, upfront racism, as well as microaggressions throughout my life. So having, I look at that, the effects of the hypermasculinity, the socialization, what I picked up in my, again, early adolescence, my earlier years. I didn't have the best coping skills. Joining the military, a predominantly male institution, the infantry to be more specific, I ended up deploying to Afghanistan at the age of 20, so accumulating baggage along the way. By the time I left the military after 6 years of service, I had a criminal record. I had 2 separate incidents throughout that 6 years. So when I left, I was on probation. And again, it was the lack of coping skills for what I faced in throughout life. With what I'm trying to do today with Strength in a Circle, I draw on those experiences of hypermasculinity, of toxic masculinity. I look at, well, what is the alternative? It's healthy masculinity. As boys were given these messages to not express emotions, to not cry, to man up, to be tough. And when we go through life, when we go through trauma, when we go through what a lot of the things that we're facing in our communities, then we don't have the ability to use the resources that may be available to us to reach out for support, and we often, as a result of repressing all of that baggage, we'll call it, we sometimes choose less healthier alternatives.
Wonderful. Thank you with that. And just given the time, I think I may be asking one more question. I'm just trying to decide what a good one would be. And we were talking about inadequate supports. And I will say, a lot of what I heard when it comes to the child welfare system is we really don't need to be taking children out of the home. What we need are support programs to support that healthy living, healthy lifestyle, what that looks like. And with that, you talked about we really are reactionary when it comes to providing these services. Something happens, and we see this a lot in these crisis situations. Say, for instance, suicide crises will have something happen in the community, and there's a reaction to send in supports. But oftentimes, the funding and the support isn't maintained, it's in and out. And I'm wondering, it's a big question I have for you, but really, how do we move? Can we move from this reaction based piece to being proactive and really start to really take in some of those restorative justice principles and practices?
Yes, so I'm actually looking into community safety planning, and what I see. So sorry, I have somebody knocking on the door. What I see is uh, as a result of that reactionary thinking, a lot of the times we're perpetuating a lot of the problems, and we send a lot of our men and women down to these institutions for criminal justice related issues, and a lot of times when they go to these institutions, they're coming back with even more issues rather than dealing with what they're going through, rather than applying a trauma focused lens and providing that support. And we see the same thing in our child welfare system. When we use upstream thinking, when we ask the questions why, uh, when we keep going down, or down that path, and looking at a surface level issue in the community, we ask why. Well, and then we come to a cause, and we keep asking why and why, and it always comes down to breakdown of family dynamics, problems in the home, things that are trauma related. So trauma is at the root of many of the issues that we're facing. And so in response to that, we need more support, we need more care, we need more systems that mechanize empathetic connection. And so for myself, taking this work home to Northern House Cree Nation, we were faced with a lot security issues and hiring issues for security for some of the larger events. And so this concern was brought to my attention, and I feel that it was brought to my attention because of my military background. So it was brought to my attention because of different worldviews and different paradigm. But what I was looking at this issue through was through my healing-based lens of through what I've gone through, my journey, and how I got to where I'm at today, and that's through all the support that has been afforded to me. So what I've done is I framed it as a social enterprise, and looking at the issue with hiring is because our local hiring pool, a lot of the men exhibit behavioral issues, which the community has brought to the attention of the representatives doing the hiring, and so rather than just using Western thinking, for a security outfit, it's often property orientated, and it's doesn't have that focus on a supportive work culture. So that was the intent of the social enterprise, was to create a supportive work culture, which is trauma informed. But then on top of that, what are the services we're actually engaging in, and looking at the prevalence of violence in our community, seeing that there's a lot of gang dynamics, substance abuse issues. Our youth, they need role models. They need to see our men and women reaffirming those roles, or taking back those roles from those strong institutions, those strong systems that our ancestors had prior to colonization. And for our men, we were protectors and providers, and so looking at that, and so what I've done with some of these men is I've gotten them into crisis intervention training, and really just bringing them into programs that are trauma focused, and a lot of them challenge their own biases, what they're going through, and so that they can better operate in the community and better intervene with our youth and provide them that strong role model that our young people need.
Thank you so much, Johnny, for sharing your insight, sharing a little bit about your history and experiences and how that's influenced you and kind of working with our men. And really, it's something, I see in communities today is that, strong emphasis, just as you said, man up, don't show emotion, you just have to bear with it no matter whatever that pain might be. And it's something we see in general. And, what I've seen a lot is the residential schools, colonial systems so broadly were very effective in erasing that ability for us to say, this is who I am, this is where I came from, which then erases that ability to create that path forward. And all the programs I've seen that have been so beneficial provide that reconnection to culture, language, identity, to be able to answer those questions, get that understanding, and make that way forward. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm now going to invite our third guest before we bring all three back for a Q&A. Hello, Dr. Richard Verdan. I mispronounced your name earlier. I'm correcting it now. Thank you so much for joining us in this third portion and section of today's video before we do the Q&A. Now, I just see a question come on. How much longer is this talk? Well, we do 1 hour of dialogue, and then we go to a 30-minute Q&A. So there's about 45 minutes or so left. Now, before I jump into some questions for you, Richard, I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit more about yourself.
Before I introduce myself, I want to raise my hands to Kathy and Johnny for the work they've done in their own lives and in the community. And Kukshdam. My name is Chichaleches, also known as Richard Peters Abbey Verdan. I am in Stehekin, which is top of the hill in Swassen Territory, south of Vancouver. My great-grandfather, Johnny Peters, was from this territory in Chihuahua. My great-grandmother, Catherine Moses, from Hybar in the interior. My grandmother, my grandmother, Amelia Peters, was from Clinton, as was my father, Hector Peters Abbey Verdan. All my grandparents, my grandmother, my father were all attended residential school from the 1800s through to the 1920s and 30s. I'm a 78-year-old grandfather, soon to be 79. If my father had not left his territory in 1940 and stayed away for 30 years, I certainly, along with I have a younger brother, 3 younger sisters, we would all have been sent to residential school. In fact, my mother, Mary, is an English war bride. My father, when he would talk about it, he was well into his 70s in the 1990s, at the time when Hubert O'Connor was being tried for his his rape of our life givers, and I attended his trial to support 2 of my cousins who were there. Hector finally discussed that he was there. He'd been there for 3 years in St. Joseph's residential school in the Mission in Williams Lake. And when he attended, he only spoke Sushabnchin. And he remembers his first day being greeted by, this was in the 1920s, a tall man in a black robe, black cowboy hat, black cowboy boots, and a bullwhip. And the bullwhip was used for punishment. Hector was there until he contracted rheumatic fever and was nursed back to health after being bedridden by my grandparents using traditional medicines. And then he left, and he 1940s, he was left the reserve and was working in Williams Lake and playing. He was a very good hockey player in spite of his illness. And he was let go by the company he was working for. He was working as a laborer, and the contractor said, "Hector, you're my best worker." He was 16 at the time. He said, "You're my best worker. You show up, but it's depression time. There's people saying, why isn't an Indian working when there's white men who lead work?" He realized then that there were some things you can't change. Close after that, the recruiting sergeant from the Rocky Mountain Rangers, New Westminster Regiment, came along, and Hector enlisted and served 11 years, went overseas in North Africa with the New Westminster Regiment in North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, and Holland. Met my mother during training in Sussex. I was born in the wartime England, 1944. And we stayed there till 4 years of age. If you'll indulge me, I'll show some family photos just to, not sure if that shows up. That's that's 1945. I'm thinking about a year old. We came back to Canada at 52. My father worked hard as a laborer, truck driver in Southern Ontario. We lived in the Haudenosaunee territory, a place called Stony Creek outside Hamilton. And that whole time, I remember one of the first words I heard in England is the word half caste, in terms of why do we look the way we look. And I remember asking my father, and he gave me a look that told me that's not something I ever want to discuss. We found out later Hector did speak fluent Shuswap throughout his life, but he thought he was protecting us by not sharing that. Also, as he thought he was protecting us by isolating us from any extended family. We were thousands of miles from our family and our Shuswap family in BC and our English family in Sussex as a way of control. Hector worked hard. He worked hard he was in one job for close to 40 years and raised the 5 of us. He was not a violent man in the home. I can't remember being struck by him. All he had to do was look at us and we'd say, okay, scramble. What is it you want? I think if he ever taken a swat at us, he would have lost the edge because we were like, well, this isn't so bad. But in the community, he had a reputation of don't mess with him, and that was a real burden, to be in that angry phase. He was not expressive. He was I think 1 or 2 times in the early age when he would say, "I love you." The time when I spent 11 years in the Air Force, the RCAF 66 to 77, and in 1968 when I'd heading off to Winnipeg to go to flight school, and my wife and I, and first time Dad came out as we drove off from Hamilton to Winnipeg, he said, "I love you." And that seemed very strange. It seemed wonderful, but again, he had not grown up in a family home. He had not had life's lessons on how does a father relate to a son and a daughter. And that's the legacy of the residential school. And we didn't know that at the time. So it wasn't until 1969-70 when we came out and got in contact with our relatives who said, "Put your name on the ban list." We said, "What do you mean?" "Well, your name is Abby." That was my father's adopted name when my grandmother married into sugarcane. And he used the name Verdan when he enlisted. And added 2 years to his name. So that started a journey. I spent 11 years in the Air Force, in the Canadian Forces, after flying training I was switched over to be a social work officer in 1960. I'm based in Winnipeg. I was in Air Command and at the time setting up a drug and alcohol treatment program for the Canadian Armed Forces, the Army, Air Force, and Navy. And there was a great deal of self-medication encouraged. There was the tradition of spicing the main brace and all of the messes and institutes that involved in the culture of beverage alcohol and the consequences of that. I did take early retirement after 11 years. My relatives said, "We need you back home." I had volunteered with Doris Young with the Manitoban Brotherhood and also with the Manitoba Native Pathfinders. I met some marvelous people there, and both my children were born in Winnipeg. Coming back, I was looking for a job description. How was a 33-year-old father of 3 in 1970 supposed to relate? How do you dress? How do you conduct yourself? I'm having a conversation with my younger brother, relative Leonard George, and he said, "That's how are you supposed to conduct yourself?" I knew when I was in the military, I had two rings on my arm, so I'm a captain. So here's the Queen's orders and regulations, and there's some security in that, but there's all kinds of prescribed ways. I know we're short on time, so I'll jump ahead.
I was going to say you were sensing it as soon as I jumped on screen. I had some questions, and I thought I have one that links so well, which is I was told you're working on a new research project related.
Well, I'm working on several. One was with the guys Amanda LaValle and Raven Sinclair. That's a shirt looking at racism in the institutions. But the other one that I have been working on through the Emeritus College is intergenerational psychological trauma and intergenerational trauma. I'm working with a veterans transition group at UBC with counseling psych and also Dr. Judith Hall, who's a professor emeritus in medicine, family medicine, also a clinical geneticist. So some of the things that Kathy and Johnny said about, we talk about doing things for the 7th generation. I know many of the grandmother's teachings are when a life care was known to be carrying a child, that she was removed from the stresses within the community. Now we know that stress has the epigenetics are such that our susceptibility for cardiovascular issues, respiratory issues, type 2 diabetes, and also how we relate to stress, how we respond in stressful situations. Is passed on. It doesn't change our genes as such. It changes our epigenetics in terms of which bipolar switches are on. So those are things that our ancestors knew. They didn't discuss it in terms of that biogeneticists would be, but they understood the importance and dealing with that. I worked also with a group called Warriors Against Violence, and working with intergenerational survivors, and many simply didn't know their story. I didn't know my story, and I'm still finding out my story. So when you're on a journey, you need to know where what's their point of departure if you want to get to have a destination. And many of the stories, they were family secrets. It was not safe, and it was not okay. And that became, I'm talking to some of the young men in the wars. They said they walked around walked around with this huge anger all the time. They didn't know why. And some of the insights they had when they learned that their parents or relative or grandparent had been taken. They hadn't gone. There was no choice about it. They were taken to residential school. I used to think my father Hector was that he would not do anything that was not a full and informed choice, not realizing that were things that you can't change the color of your skin, your features, so you're not going to have a job. So you go into denial. That carries a whole stress. And returning to our culture, returning to sweat lodge, returning to ceremonies, talking circles is so powerful. And doing that on an ongoing basis, doing it not when you feel you need it, but doing it as a self-care maintenance. Because you wait till, if you wait till you need it, it's too late. And those things were taken away from us. The federal government, they talk about, well, we made mistakes. They weren't mistakes. The papal bulls of the 1400s, 52, and the Indian Act and the 60s, those weren't mistakes. That was the system working as it was intended to work. to break down the circle of the family, to have people come over with a sense of shame of who they were, sense of shame of themselves and others like them, and the importance of the courage of Johnny to talk, to spend time with that young man that physically attacked him, and to look beyond that individual to see the human being behind and understand that human being. We have 7 generations behind us and 7 going forward we know of. And each one of those has an impact on who we are today. Coach Dan.
Looking for my unmute button. Thank you for sharing that. You addressed a whole bunch of questions I had already on hand. So
I should add, again, I've thought, if I'm somebody, I have to say something, but otherwise I'll forget. Kathy and Johnny talked about how we pass lessons on. I know before I'm still a work in progress, but I pass lessons on to my children that lessons I'd learned that I didn't know I'd learned, and how to break that cycle. That awareness, and not using the fact that one is a second, third, or fourth generation residential school survivor as a rationale for one's conduct, but as a starting point to say, okay, here's the situation, having the responsibility. And one of my very good friends who's passed the other side of it is a hamatsa, or when you go on a vision quest and you have that story, that song that comes to you, that comes with a responsibility, because you can use those gifts in a productive, socially productive, community oriented way, or you can use it to do harm. And we have those choices to make. So it's important that we be aware of that, and we're not just along for the ride. We are it's a hard work. The challenge is that we keep getting triggered. We're not in the post-colonial era. Things are happening right as we speak that are creating the next generation of institutional and systemic racism and traumatizing people. And the things that happened in the media, there's been a whole series of half measures. When I was teaching in the early 70s, I was teaching at Lakehead and University and the Confederation College, and then the issues of the mercury poisoning and all the things that Louis Cameron and the Ojibwe Wars were dealing with. Those issues are still happening now. Boil water advisories. I know from the military, they have the technical prowess power and structure to come in, and everybody can have clean water right now. You look at so it's not a matter of lack of resources; it's a matter of political will.
Thank you so much for that. And we're now at the point in time I'm going to invite Johnny and Kathy back on screen. And I'm going back to the audience watching. Please put in your comments, put in your questions. I'm going to pull one up that came in very early on, and I'm going to pose it to everyone here. And the question was, how do we help those who are so entrenched, say, in their traumas or possibly in the system that they cannot see? Are there ways to help them and support them? And I don't know if we, maybe I'll start with Kathy and then Johnny and go to Richard. I'll go with that route.
So I run into this quite often when I'm doing my presentations across the country about people who are naysayers and they still, it didn't happen. It wasn't that bad. You just want money. I run into it quite often of people who they just don't get it. They just don't see how much trauma has impacted our people because of the residential schools, and how much it's impacting us today, and how much is it going to impact our generations coming forward. They just don't see it that way. They see it as in just get over it already. And so how do we deal with those people? And we have to just be we have to meet them where they're at and understand that everything we do in life is learned. Okay, so where did they learn this? Where did this attitude come from? Where did this behavior come from? Where did their notions come from? And it was probably learned in the home. 99% of the time it was learned at home, because they were raised in a home that has some, maybe there's some racism there, maybe there's some preconceived notions about Indigenous people. Whatever it was, they learned it from somewhere. And so we just kind of have to keep at it and keep at them and be, non-judgmental too. Because just like it wasn't our parents' fault how they raised us, because they didn't know any better, they weren't taught any better, they were removed from love and put into these institutions. It's the same thing with people who don't understand. They were raised a certain way to believe certain things, and so we can't really blame them. We just have to be, um, we just have to keep at it, right? And gently though, because just like, we wouldn't want to be talked at, talked down to, they don't want to be talked down to either. But it's still sharing that information though, and bringing those teachings forward, and including them, in things that we're doing, so that they can see the impact rather than just hearing about it on the news, right? Because what people hear on the news is, the news is going to make up whatever they wanted to us, whatever they think the people want to hear, right? And a quick example of that is, we were listening to the news one day. This is a couple of years ago now, and one story was about a non-Indigenous man, a Caucasian man who had, I forget what he had done. He robbed a store or something like that, and they said his name, but that was it. They said, 30-year-old so and so, and he was charged with this. A couple of stories later, like it was only maybe 5 minutes later, they did a news story about an Indigenous man who had basically done the same thing, but what they did was they said his name. They said he was arrested in the North End, at his home in the North End of Winnipeg. He's from this First Nation. He has these prior charges. Like, why did you say that about this Indigenous man? Bring out where he's from. Okay, so he lives in the North End. You said that he was arrested at his home in the North End. Why are you dragging the whole community into it now? Why are you saying he's from this community? And why is it that you have to bring up all his previous charges? You didn't do that to the Caucasian man that you reported on. So we have to be careful, what we listen to in the news. And non-Indigenous people, when they're hearing the news, that's what they're hearing. And that's what they're building, basing their knowledge of Indigenous people on, is what they hear in the news. Just like when the compensation process was going on, I forget how many billion of dollars it was, but then they're like, oh, all the Indians are just lying about what happened to them so they could get money, so that they could get rich. These Indians are getting rich off of saying they were traumatized, when the most anybody ever got was maybe 100,000 if they were lucky, for what they endured for years and years of trauma. So it's what they hear in the news too that's not helping our situation as Indigenous people, trying to get the message across, right?
Thank you for those insights. And it's something that I do see so often. And I guess it's one of the reasons why they turn off comments on a lot of Indigenous-based news stories, is the visceral that we see come out, especially when people are able to hide behind that veil of anonymity, to be able to express those true views that they have, based upon that very narrow scope and perspective. So thank you for sharing. I'm going to go to Jonathan or Johnny now to get your thoughts.
First off, we need to stop talking about history in this context as it has happened, but start talking about it as it is happening. When we talk about historical trauma, we talk about the historical trauma as it is happening, the collective trauma that is ongoing through the colonial violence. And we need to engage in these processes of collective consciousness raising, bringing that awareness to what is going on in our homes, in our backyard, what is going on in our communities, and so through that process, we decentralize or we mobilize leadership from the grassroots through these processes, and because that's what we need is an awakening, especially from our youth, to take that torch and look at what's going on and asking ourselves. So as Kathy mentioned, rather than just pointing at what's wrong in the community, being able to do that, but then pointing back, and when we talk about the history as we're living through it, that puts us in a very powerful place in our ability to contribute to the history moving forward, the path moving forward. What do I have the power to contribute to? What gifts do I have to share? And so from that is mechanizing or mobilizing these supports, because we need more empathy in our community. We need more connection. There's a lot of advocacy for more treatment centers, but with that, we need to recognizing the collective trauma that our entire communities have gone through. It's as if the community itself has to become the treatment center, and so this creating this healing society, what does that look like? Because that is going to be the vehicle that gets us towards that place that we all want to be, is in our collective healing, where we take back those ancestral philosophies and we inform our policies and our institutions in a way that is how our ancestors intended to. And so it's really just beefing up and bulking up those supports, because you can't impose treatment on individuals, and we always look at it on case by case basis. What does this individual need? We got to start looking at, no, what do we all need? What are we facing together, and how do we bring people together to wrap around an issue and get those multiple perspectives through those practices of popular education, and that is action based, and that mobilizes that knowledge.
Thank you, John, for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to round out to Richard for last comments on this question. I have a few more that have come in now.
Go stem. I'd like to echo the words of Jonathan, but information, if it's only received cognitively, intellectually, it's easy to dismiss. We're getting to the fact where people, not far from yourself, board talk about alternate facts. Both in the current situation and historically, I think to look at what the phenomena is. How does it make you feel? How do you relate to it? What does it do viscerally? How does it make your gut feel? How do you relate to it spiritually? And it is important to go back. I think we're Longhouse, Potlatch Longhouse people, and we come together at least twice a year, and we start by looking at the history, so we can situate ourselves in the present. In order, we don't get stuck in the history, but so we can move forward. And as I mentioned, the government of Canada there's a whole series of half measures. They've put a Band-Aid on things without looking at what's the underlying cause. And whether it's, that's happening as we speak. Whose truth needs to be told? How does it make people uncomfortable? And if it does make people uncomfortable, I challenge those who won't say, what is it that makes you uncomfortable about dealing with that? We can say that the trauma is not unique. You want to compare trauma, but there's many the populations in Canada who are here because of their own personal trauma they don't want to deal with. And if they, in order to deal with the original owners of the land, they have to deal with their own trauma, that is very uncomfortable. They don't want to go there. And they don't like to be reminded. And they will attack those people who remind them. And again, there's a huge discrepancy. I'm very much in favor of bringing in the resources into the communities rather than bring, and if someone is not socially, is antisocial in their behavior, not removing, not incarcerating them, because as John said, that only makes, all they do is they learn to be worse. You know, there's a whole subculture. And there's, again, in the military, I'm involved with the research now in some of the extremism that's taking place in the Canadian military. And that's a huge concern. Again, bringing the resources in, discussing it. That intellectually, emotionally, again, within the context of the medicine mill. And that's hard work. Again, sorry, our communities were never designed to be functioning places of growth and development. In terms of you look at the pittance, in terms of the acreage, whether it's in the prairies or across the country, they were never designed to be socially, geographically, economically generative. You know, our communities are, I think, the United Nations Human Development Index, where Canada is 13th, we're worse off than most third world countries. So having people removed for treatment programs and then putting them back into some place which is not, is not healthy. And the other side, I have to mention, is I know in some like the communities, the elements of non-Indigenous organized crime, they love it because they exploit the communities, they exploit the people, they prey upon our young people and draw them in. So I think elements of my experience in the military, that the whole dynamics of family, gangs, and the military are quite synonymous in the sense of having a place to belong, having a purpose. So we need to bring in strong, and it's not going to happen overnight. We didn't get to where we are overnight, and so the governments want a quick one-size-fits-all fix. Is not going to work. I've seen far too many of them. Coach.
Thank you so much. This is going to lead, this is a little bit of a longer question. It was so long it got cut off. So I'm going to read the full thing, even the part that was missed. And it is, as an Indigenous worker working within their job field, I generally find workers don't understand those intricacies of intergenerational trauma. So how do I approach this lack of understanding they have in a way that is non-combative? Because I think I understand the sense of that question, and it's something we see sometimes is, again, if it comes off too strong, I find there's an automatic defensive response that I see when it comes to education and awareness. And so any thoughts how someone might be able to address this? And I guess I'll go back around again, back to Kathy, and we'll do our full circle.
Yeah, so this is exactly why I go across the country and do my presentation, because sometimes you need, and I actually saw it in the chat, a couple of people saying that they, how do I do this? How do I do this in my workplace? How can I, do this? And it's going to take more than you, unfortunately, because what's going to happen is it's going to end up being, because of that being defensive, it's going to end up being them against you. And so that's going to cause a lot of turmoil in your life, being the one, they think they're good, or they think they're better, or they think, whatever. And so sometimes you need to bring in someone else from outside, like a third party, to come in and to do those teachings with them, and to give examples, like good, solid examples. For myself, I use examples from my own life. And I'm very open with those examples, right? And some of them are some of them make me cry still when I talk about them. But I use my own life as examples, because then it puts a real face to a story. Like, you can tell stories all day long till you're blue in the face, but until you make it real for someone, or get them to see it from their perspective. Like, what if this was my family? Then they're not going to, there's not going to be any change. There's not going to be, everything will just remain the same. Because if it's the same, then they don't have to look, they don't have to go deeper within themselves. They don't have to go to that uncomfortable place. Right. So, but once you take them to that uncomfortable place and you sort of make them go through it with you, then they understand a little bit more. And so people will not change until their desire to change becomes greater than their desire to remain the same. And so bringing them into that uncomfortable space together is, it brings them to a place where they're going to want to now make some changes. So it can't be one person. It really can't, because you're putting too much pressure on yourself. As you don't want to be the token Indian, right? You don't want to be that token Indian in your organization, or if you're in an Indigenous organization that maybe still doesn't understand all of those intergenerational traumas and what we're going through as intergenerational survivors, then yeah, you really, you can't do it yourself. You can't do it alone.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing those insights. And I know it's something I say this almost every presentation, every gathering, is I love film. For me, I find film is a very good way that is able to bridge that gap between that lack of understanding and then putting themselves in that people's shoes. They see that emotional story. That's why I use it so often, because just as you said, we can lecture and give information, but it can go in one ear, out one other when they don't understand or see that importance of how it impacts themselves. And so I'll turn the virtual mic to Johnny to get your thoughts as well.
Yeah. So looking at the calls to action and for organizations to be doing the work that in this context, what needs to be done. In a different hat with the Northwest Cree Nation, the economic development team, we have taken steps towards working with organizations to make sure that they're more informed and that they're conducting operations internally in a way that is recognizing what's going on, and there's those processes of, again, consciousness raising. But to get into the processes, it's about creating those safe spaces, so that they can so that there's those that dialogue happening, and those stories are being shared, but then rather than lecturing or directing information, asking questions that might be challenging, and that challenges the biases that individuals might have. So that's just some of my my suggestions and my insight from it.
Thank you, Johnny, so much for those comments and thoughts. And we'll round this question out with Richard. What were your thoughts when it comes to some of the challenges that we face?
Relationship, holistic relationship, respectful relationship is so important within the family and outside within oneself. Relationship takes time, and it's a circular process. You can't say, okay, I've accomplished, now I don't have to take care of relations. And with colleagues, those who are simple, well, I don't use the word simple, those who are amenable to being informed with different points of view. Having a relationship that is not just problem focused, a relationship that is not focused solely on disagreements. That takes time, it takes and it takes energy. One of my cousin aunt, she's passed now, she would be well into she was close to 100 when she passed the other side. She'd been ticked to Louis Gabriel, and she was a residential school survivor. Her children, my cousins all, and she had enough kids and grants. She had Louise had her own baseball league, and she was a great fan of fastball. And I was having a difficult occasion. She gave me a kind of a Forrest Gump equivalent to a box of chocolates using baseball, a fastball. She said, when a fastball's coming at you, you can't pretend it's not coming at you. You're going to get hit, and it's going to hurt. But you don't want to hold your hands rigid. You need to take it and take that energy, like wax on, wax off. Did you? I'm sorry. This is too. I shouldn't be facetious, but not pretending it's not happening. And there may be those occasions where there's some people you simply have to. Okay, we're never going to get to. You're limited in your time, energy, and your health. So differentiating who are the allies and who are the potential, who's the strength, strategic planning. So again, relationship, but taking the time to be balanced in yourself. I sit here, I'm aware my shoulders are, that means I know I'm in stress. So taking that time to take care of yourself so you're not in a stressful relationship and that you're projecting some negative. And we've got lots of reasons. I know my father Hector, he went around with an aura that said, "Don't mess with me." And that was a real burden. And it shows itself up in cardiovascular illness. This is a huge issue in men and women. It's a non-discriminatory. Become a member of the Cardiac Adventurers Club, and you don't want to go there. Believe me, so taking care of and dealing with, as Kathy and Johnny's, with how does it relate to that person's circumstance, speaking in terms that they can understand. And people may be dismissive, say, "Well, I don't care." Well, you should care. You're a member of this. Canada's a community of the balance of rights and obligations. You can't simply be there as a taker. And again, it's hard work. It takes time and energy.
Thank you so much for rounding that out. And I know we're just about out of time and we have some more questions, but I given the heavy talk nature, intergenerational trauma, I kind of just want to shift focus at this end here a little bit to that hope and resilience. And is there something that has occurred that you've witnessed, that you've experienced, that really kind of gives that light at the end of the tunnel, helps you keep going? What is something that has inspired you and keeps you working in this? Because in this work as well, I know how heavy that toll can be. And we've had discussions about taking care of oneself. But I want to get a better understanding maybe on this last question here. What is an inspirational piece? What has kept you going? And again, I'll start with Kathy and we'll round out the conversation.
So, what keeps me going in doing this work is just seeing how appreciative our Indigenous people are. Like when we run workshops and hand drum making and ribbon skirt making and those kind of things, like to some people those might be small or insignificant or, well, that's not important. But to a lot of our people who are trying to reclaim culture and that connection to culture, those are big, those are huge. And just to see that, how appreciative they are to us when we do that. But also is, when I go across country and I do these presentations and I might get in a lecture hall, 150 students in a lecture hall, and if one student comes down to talk to me, I usually have a lineup after, but if one student comes down to talk to me with tears in their eyes, a non-Indigenous student, or maybe they're Indigenous from another country, and they come down to talk to me and they've got tears in their eyes and they say, I'm so sorry. That is what keeps me going, because if I can reach one person, then I've done my job, because that one person's going to take that, what they've learned, and they're going to pass it on to their family members, and their family members are going to take it and pass it on. And so, that's what keeps me going. is having faith in humanity and having faith that people will one day see where we're coming from, and why is it we have, here in Winnipeg, you drive down Main and Higgins, you get to Main and Higgins, and you see the people, and you see that they're in addictions, and you see the turmoil that they're going through, and instead of judging them, have an understanding of why this person is there, what brought them there in their life. And so that's what keeps me going.
Thank you for that. Johnny, anything that stands out to you? What keeps your hope up? What keeps you inspired and moving ahead?
Ceremony. And as Richard said, not just one-offs going to ceremony as a checklist, but living through that lens. When I go to that tree to make an offering and I pray, I always start with gratitude, and that's so that I'm recognizing the things that I'm grateful for in my walk. Both what may look bad, what might have been a hardship, but looking at them as lessons, and grateful for the air that I breathe, grateful for life itself. And when we go to Sundance, we go there to foster empathy. We go there to empathize with the ant. We fast and we because we live in a society that's egocentric, and it's designed, it incentivizes greed. It's hyper individualized. It's take. We're very disconnected. So when we live through ceremony, it's about, well, how do I connect? How do I understand the world around me? And often it's through that vulnerability. It's taking off those that armor that we wear, and having the courage to be vulnerable, to want to connect with others. And so ceremony is we need to look at how what we're actually taking from those practices and how we're actually walking it. Things like meditation and being able to accept silence, that takes work. We're so conditioned to high speed, fast food forms of instant gratification in today's society. It's just like, how do I get things fast? And we're just pumped full of that. We're just conditioned to that, and so connecting to the land, getting out there, and being able to accept peace, being able to accept serenity, because the body it takes time for the body to heal once we start to move in that direction. Once we're quiet, then we realize what's going on when we actually sit with ourselves. So again, living ceremony.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Johnny, for sharing. And Richard, you'll be our last comments of the day. Throughout your long career and everything you've observed and experienced, what keeps you going?
I don't spend as much time, for a variety of reasons, as I did in the community, but I was a decade or so on the board of the Native Peace Liaison in the downtown East Sydney, and always inspired by the generosity and the kindness of the people there, who are their circumstance, and really dire circumstance. So that is inspiring. I've not learned a lot, but one of the things I've come to understand is there's no such thing as a casual encounter. And that is both the duality of all things. That's both a beauty and a burden, because we never know what we say, what our expression says, what our words will say, what our tone will say, that will have a major impact on a person's where they go. You know, as Yogi Berra said, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. You know, how many times have we come to a fork in the road and not realize it till many years later, and then we reflect, and it's kind of terrifying. You think, okay, I could have gone this way, it would be a whole different story. But having that relationship, and taking the time. The challenge we have is that in a fast-moving society, you know, so I remember in Winnipeg going for a walk with when my kids were in daycare and going for a walk of 2 to 5 year olds, and this was in Silver Heights, and we're spread over 2 blocks because some are way out front, others are holding hand, one behind. So, you know, social change. You know, that's how do we get that group together? And it's again perseverance, having networks to discuss and sometimes commiserate and be supportive, you know, to ensure that our own needs are being met. And again, addressing the consequence of the people who don't want to know. You know, I remember when I was in Winnipeg, I was working with Don McCaskill, who's at University of Winnipeg at the time. I was living in East Transcona, East Kildonan. And I thought, well, people who commute, there's ways to get to Portage and, you know, the other side of the city center without going down Main and Higgins. So you could live your whole life by either looking towards the Queen Elizabeth, you know, cultural center and not seeing what was on the west side of the street. The same here in Vancouver, downtown east side. That if you take the Georgia Viaduct, you don't have to see just the absolute situation that's at Main and Hastings. So again, having that awareness, being persevering, and I raise my hand to you, those who are in that work, and take time for yourselves and your family on a regular basis, and don't feel guilty about it. I'm not sure I like the term resilience. I think back in another. I know I used to a couple of times. I was going to Stony Mountain with the Brotherhood in 1969. I learned the proper licks to Folsom Prison Blues. There was a really good guitar. The guys there are a couple things they're really good at. And one was, you know, lifting weights and playing music. And some are very, you know, doing university degrees and so forth. But at the same time, there was Johnny Cash had a song about a boy called A Boy Named Sue. And is that, you know, and I hear that, oh, don't you feel good about how rough we made it? You're so strong and resilient. We're going to keep sticking it to you. And you should be grateful. No, we're not. We are resilient. We're surviving, but we're going to start doing it our way. Yeah. Coach down. It's an honor to spend time with each of you, Kathy, Jonathan, Kayla, and Naomi. I did come in 2 hours early rather than 2 hours late. I was going on my air navigation Zulu time, and I didn't allow for the high tide. Anyway, sorry.
No apologies at all. And I'll say I don't want to extend the conversation too long. I also have challenges with the term resilience, whether it glorifies the presence of violence. Are there better terms that represent our strength and the opportunities of growth to working in a deficit model? Is that trauma-informed approach? But that's a whole other discussion for a whole other time.
Yeah.
And I just want to put a big thank you, everyone who was attending and watching. Although we didn't pull up all the comments and questions, we do see them come in. Everyone can read them. So thank you for that engagement. Thank you, Kathy, Johnny, Richard, for participating in today's dialogue. It's much appreciated. And I will say we've now come to the end of our conversation. And so on behalf of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, I would like to thank everyone who attended, our participants for engaging. And I want to put everyone to remind you that we have more NCTR dialogues coming up. Stay tuned for news for the March dialogue, when we're going to be taking a look at the land back movement and what that actually means. But with that, thank you so much. Hi, and I can't wait to see you all again. Goodbye.
Mitaki Epi.